Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. The focus of our webinar this morning is school budget pressures, the role of governors. Very warm welcome from Linda and myself. I'm sorry, Linda's photographs disappeared off my slide this morning. I do apologise, but Linda's on the other line. Hi, Linda.
And I was having trouble unmuting myself. Good morning, everyone.
Hi there, and Linda and I are here from Better Governor, and we're delighted as ever to be supporting Governors for Schools with this webinar this morning. And please, this is your webinar, so do use the question and answer panel, and we'll respond to those. If you've got any questions or comments that you want to make throughout, we've got a very large number of people joining us this morning, which is lovely, but bear with us if we don't get to all the questions. We will respond to you once the event is over. So as far as the aims of today's session are concerned, what we want to do first and foremost is reflect on some of the drivers for school financial concerns in the autumn term of 2022, and obviously they'll go forward into 2023 as well. We're aware that some of you may have actually joined the session that Linda and I delivered as part of the Governors for Schools conference a couple of weeks ago. We're not going to be repeating that, but we will be extending some of the themes that we talked about there. So what we want to do is focus really on the expectations around governance and to clarify those with specific regard to our obligations in terms of setting balanced budgets in our schools and trusts. And we're very aware that clearly current economic climate, that's a challenge for an awful lot of us right now. So what we are going to be doing is hopefully exploring some of the options that are available, some of the actions that we might want to take, but certainly looking at the sort of things that as governors within our own governing boards, be they in trusts or in the maintained school sector, the sort of things that we ought to be considering now as we approach 2023. So first and foremost, I'm sure nobody can have failed to be aware that there is something of an economic crisis at the moment, but of course that's spilled over really to create what is being described by many right now as a funding crisis in schools. And we're not trying to be alarmist in this, we're really reflecting what's happening in the world, and I'm sure many of you as governors will be only too aware that school finances are coming under a huge amount of pressure at the moment. And I'm not going to read all of these headlines out to you, you can see them for yourself, but these are a selection of headlines that have come out really in the last couple of weeks since that mini fiscal event that now is being acknowledged as a mini budget 2.5–3 weeks ago. But it was looming before then, and even before we had the new government that we have at the moment. What we were beginning to see was some indications from central government that some of those things that perhaps we've taken for granted in the past in terms of funding weren't actually going to continue this year. So the Teachers' Pay Award, we know isn't exactly in line with inflation, it's getting near to it in some areas, but the Teachers' Pay Award this year, somewhere between 5% at the top scales and 9% at the lower ones, is going to be unfunded, it looks like. Support staff pay awards, and of course all of the other inflationary aspects that we've got, because inflation sits where it does right now. Those inflationary pressures come to bear on our schools as well, of course, and not least of all the energy crisis, and many of us have actually not seen the full impact of that in terms of the first autumn/winter bills yet, but all of those things are conspiring together to put an awful lot of our schools under extreme financial pressure in the current fiscal year, or even if some of us are sitting on balances at the moment, in other words, a financial carry forward from one year to the next, those are evaporating very quickly. And apologies if you don't know who this person is, I'm possibly showing my age by putting this slide in this morning, but this is a picture of Harold Wilson, who was actually Prime Minister many years ago. Even I was a little boy when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister, but he was famous for saying that a week is a long time in politics, and that's just my probably not terribly amusing way of actually getting into what's happened in the last. Oh, Ian's just put a comment on, he remembers him. That makes me feel a lot warmer inside. Thank you. But of course, this last 7 days has seen a lot of things going on in Westminster, and I'm not even talking about what happened yesterday. But certainly with the new Chancellor that we've got, some of the things that he said and possibly some of the things that he didn't say in his initial speech have caused a lot of anxiety amongst the teaching unions and professional associations for head teachers, etc. And a lot of this is talking about further cuts in all departmental budgets. The impact that's going to have on schools is actually quite worrying. The spending cuts that are looming, and of course the threat of industrial action has been around for a couple of months now. These are all headlines that have actually emerged in the last 48 hours. And again, I'm not trying to be alarmist or trying to be too depressive on this, but we are facing a very, very difficult situation at the moment. For many of us, as governors, this will be the first time in any significant way that we found our schools under quite the budget pressure that we've actually got at this point in time. So, of course, what we have to think about is what have those drivers been? And I've almost rehearsed this a little bit already, and we've talked about the Teachers' Pay Award and the Support Staff Pay Award. Now, it has to be said that the Teachers' Pay Award has not been fully funded for the last few years. It's been funded at what the government referred to as the maximum and the minimum of the pay ranges. So the top and the bottom had been funded by government, but those in between were down to our schools. So we've had a little bit of an inkling of what that looks like, but this year there is going to be no funding at all from central government. So any pay awards, and we have no option but to pay them because they're performance related, of course, for an awful lot of staff, they are going to come straight off that bottom line of our budget. And again, many schools, under advice from local authorities, central government, were budgeting for 2-3% this year. And of course, the reality is for an awful lot of schools, it's at least double that. Support staff, we've talked about. Energy cost inflation. Lots of schools have seen lots of different forecasts coming their way. One of the schools that I'm involved in is a very large secondary academy. Our energy budget is actually tripling for the year that we're in at the moment, it looks like, and that's a pretty scary number. We're looking at in excess of £270,000 as an energy budget for next year, whereas last year it was about 87. So we're getting into difficult territory for an awful lot of us. Some of us don't know quite where that's actually going to land up yet, and of course one has to compound that with other inflationary pressures as well. The fact that some government grants are not being increased by the inflation percentage at the moment, and I'm thinking of things there like the pupil premium, sports premium, etc. And some of those other grants that have actually been in place have actually now disappeared in terms of Teachers' Pay Award grant and the teachers' pension grant that was actually in place up until this current fiscal. And of course, to compound that, and it's another driver for financial pressures on our schools, is that in many areas of the country now, we are seeing fluctuating birth rates. And when I say fluctuating, for the most part, a downward trend. We've seen a fall in birth rate, and that's having a knock-on effect in terms of admission numbers in our schools, and not just in early years, but right the way throughout the school populations at every age group as a result of those birth rate fluctuations over recent years, etc. And I'm sure you'll all be very aware that if we see a reduction in the admission numbers in our school, that equates totally to the amount of funding that we get. There is a little bit, to say the least, at the moment up and down the country, but it can be anything from £4,000 up to £8,000 per pupil. And if you lose 10 pupils this year, as opposed to the number that you admitted last year, clearly you can see the impact of that. So in terms of the task that governors face, and it is a statutory task, we have to approve a balanced budget each year, and the real test for us, I think, in that first bullet point is the word balanced. Maintained schools cannot submit a deficit budget. In reality, there is no such thing as a deficit. If you're a maintained school, the local authorities, if they've got the money to be able to do so, may license a deficit, but a license deficit is two words that replace a single word, and that is loan, because a license deficit from all local authorities has to be backed up by a fairly rapid repayment plan. And for most authorities now, that's 2 years absolute maximum. So of course, it might enable you to balance a budget this year if you're able to negotiate that with the local authority. And as I say, there are no guarantees on that at all, but it's going to hurt your budget next year and the year after as well, because you have to pay the money back. Academies, part of their funding agreements with which is the contract that they actually have in place for, with the Department for Education, they are required to set out and approve a balanced budget. So there is no scope for flexibility here. And we'll look at the budget cycle in a few slides' time, but if in those initial budget planning stages you get to the point where you realize that you're heading to perhaps an in-year deficit, might be supported by reserves or a positive carry forward that you've got. When you submit that, unless you are showing a situation where next year you are reverting to a sustainable balanced budget, the Education Skills Funding Agency, on behalf of the Department for Education, they'll be on top of you. Okay, so when we think about balancing the budget, again, this is something that perhaps a lot of us as governors have maybe taken for granted historically, but this is a process now that I think governors are going to have to get closer to than maybe they've ever had to get before. I'm not talking about closer in terms of operational, but governors have to actually understand the ramifications. They have to understand some of the constituent discussions that need to take place, which will contribute towards balancing that budget. And in reality, there are only two approaches that schools can take in broad sweep terms. One is to actually increase their revenue and or their income. And of course, the other one is about reducing costs. Neither is easy, neither is necessarily palatable from a school perspective and for us as governors, but we have to be involved. We have to understand what the implications of those approaches are. So when we think about the idea that we've actually got an opportunity to sorry, I've just realized the animation's gone slightly awry on that slide, apologies. The options open to us in terms of improving or increasing our schools' revenue and or income. Of course, one of the things that a lot of people can do, and I resisted the temptation to put an ostrich with its head in the sand here, because I don't think that's a reality anyway, but we can wait for the government to actually come to the aid of schools. That may happen, it may not, but I'm not sure that that's actually a very sensible strategy. All of the indications are, and particularly from the speech that Jeremy Hunt made on Monday rather, and the comments he made last weekend, we are heading into what a lot of people are dubbing austerity 2 at the moment. And the idea is that rather than anticipate additional money coming into our schools, what we're more likely to see is further cuts in funding. So the first option probably is a non-starter, to be perfectly honest. Increasing school admissions isn't necessarily something that's in our gift to be able to do, but it is in all schools' gift to be able to influence this. And please don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. I'm not advocating that schools suddenly start trying to poach pupils from other schools, but all of us in the marketing of our schools and the way in which we promote our schools, particularly at this time of year, many of your schools and my schools will actually be doing parental tours with a view to having an impact on the admissions that will actually come through for September 2023. Have we revisited what we do there? Are we actually maximizing or optimizing, is probably a better word to use, the admissions for our schools because of the actions that we take now? We should look at what other schools are doing. Many schools now are offering far more flexibility in terms of almost parental tours on demand. I think as governors, we have to be careful with that because there are workload implications for staff in schools doing that. but there is a needs must argument here as well. And I think we have to balance that out to say, are we doing everything we can to optimize admissions for next year?
And I think, Steve, if you are in a low birth rate area, and certainly where I operate as chair, that's the case in the whole of the area, and this has been a 5-year trend, this is probably the most difficult area because we're all looking for the same group of pupils. So it is very much more about showing your school off in the best way possible to maximise your cohort each year on year, and being more generous with taking in-year admissions, which can have its challenges, particularly when you go on to talk about the next bullet point. But spending too much time in doing operational things at that level when the pool is already small and will continue to be so for a while is probably not a good use of operational time at school. Once you've done all you can, you need to move on to some of these other areas.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a couple of comments on the question panel at the moment. Somebody with no name here, and somebody that's attending this morning has actually said, as these increased costs have been introduced after we set our balanced budget, many schools in our local authority area are considering showing a deficit when our half-year budget update is submitted as a way to prove that we can't operate effectively. And we've got other comments. Ado saying, would a school be forced to shut down if they continue to run the deficit? It's a very interesting, I mean, I think none of us knows the answers to those questions at the moment. And I think the serious issue for all of us, I think, is that, we are governors because we want to provide, as Linda was just saying, the best possible education for children and young people in our schools and the best possible care. The potential is that's going to be compromised, and I think we have to make our voices heard, absolutely. And I think the idea of making sure the local authorities are aware, and I'm sure most local authorities are only too aware of the difficulties their schools are in at the moment, but I think we do have to share that. Far be it from me to suggest we all get on our political soapboxes, but making members of parliament know quite how serious the issues are. One of the big issues that we have at the moment, I think, in terms of perception out there, is that the government, quite rightly to an extent, because it's a fact, always point to and I think the figure is £3.5 billion that's sitting in school surpluses at the moment. The issue for us as governors, of course, is that's not equally distributed around the country and around schools. Many of us are sitting on perilous situations where we have no money in the coffers at all. So I think there's some very, very difficult issues there for us to actually confront at the moment. And I think all of us have to be mindful of the situation that's going on around us. So just moving on to the next bullet point there, prioritise special educational needs and disabilities, and also the EHCP's education and healthcare plan, if you're not aware of the abbreviations there. Lots of schools, particularly early years, Key Stage 1, but even where we've got junior schools, so Key Stage 1 only schools and youngsters moving into secondary, there has been a delay for whatever reason, or perhaps there's a thought process that we've got youngsters coming into the school that should perhaps have a diagnosis, should have some help through either an education or healthcare plan or some other form of additional funding. Perhaps schools putting, and again, there are workload consequences of this, but schools putting additional efforts to get those processed more quickly so that money comes through. Because of course, the education system at the moment, there is a significant lag. There's no doubt about that. Many of you will be aware that the census happened last week, in fact, but that census affects the money that we get next year. It's based on the pupils that we have now and the needs of those pupils, but that money comes 12 months down the road in terms of the next budget year. We can apply for grants, and there are numerous grants available. Some of them are very specific, and I have actually put a URL in the penultimate slide with the further information. There is an organisation that pulls together details of all of those grant making, not all charities, but charities and other organisations that are available to schools. Some are very specific, as I say. I mean, for one of the examples I like to use is Kellogg's have a grant system available for schools, but they have to be in those priority education action areas. But if your school is in one of those, that might be something to look at as a way of subsidising breakfast clubs, which frees up more money to be used on other things. And again, there are one or two others. There's some very specialist ones on sports and sciences and things like that. But again, it's a question of somebody looking at those. Now, coming back to Linda's comment a few minutes ago, this is operational, but actually this is something that isn't going to be done necessarily in schools, but maybe a governor or a couple of governors could volunteer to have a look at that and identify some that could be of potential benefit or potentially accessible for schools, and then hand that process over to the school business manager to complete. And of course, you know, those are grants, some of which are charitable. Of course, the other thing is for schools to look locally at what charities are available that may be able to support them. And again, I'm thinking here, during the pandemic, we had a situation where the government were actually funding laptops for pupils in schools, but for some reason decided to preclude Key Stage 1. So infant school children weren't eligible for that scheme. One of the schools where I'm chair of governors is an infant-only school, Key Stage 1 and early years. And we had some children who we know were sharing their mother's mobile phone with 2 or 3 other siblings, because that was the only way that they could actually participate in online learning. And we actually went to a local charity. We approached them and said, have you got any way that you could help us? We were very lucky. They actually were incredibly obliging and gave us enough money to actually purchase 12 laptops, which were then immediately distributed and utilised. It's not as easy as that, I realise it, but again, looking what goes on in your local area, parish councils, sometimes borough councils and county councils, etc., have little pots of money that they can distribute. Other charitable organisations in your area the same. So an awful lot of us, of course, are saying, well, you know, the options for increasing our revenue and our income aren't great. So cuts are the only option that we've actually got available. And of course, you know, an awful lot of us will be put into a situation where we are forced to make some quite swathing cuts to some of the areas of our budget. And of course, some of the things that we need to think about from a governance perspective in this is that, you know, what are the areas? And of course, the most significant one, because it contributes the single largest budget expense area for all of us, is staffing. It's the most painful to do. There is absolutely no doubt about that at all. And it's not very pleasant to actually think about the consequences of that. But sometimes there will be no option. And again, because of the very significant cost increases in schools this year, some of us will most definitely be looking at staff restructuring with the intention of bringing about savings. And of course, that does mean possibly redundancies, reduction of hours, that kind of thing. But the point here is, and we'll say this a little bit later, that's a process that takes time. It's a process that governors have to be involved in, but it is quite a time-consuming one. And now is probably the time to start thinking about that. But we'll say more about that a little later. Excuse me. Curriculum resources, again, for many schools, this tends to be the, if there is any contingency in the budget, a lot of schools will actually put it in this area because it does represent, to an extent, variable cost. But we have to, again, think of what in the comment that Linda made earlier, we have to prioritise children's learning. We have to prioritise the ongoing development of our curriculum, and that includes how well it's resourced, of course. But there will be schools that will be looking in that area. Training and development, professional development for teachers and all other members of staff. There are some areas that, you know, we really shouldn't cut, but undoubtedly these will be candidates. But we need to think about the bigger aim here. What are we trying to do in our schools? We want the best trained staff. We want teachers to be teaching at the best possible level they're able to. And if CPD, continuous professional development and training for teachers, is what's going to bring that about, then it would be an act of folly to actually cut that. But for some of us, that may be no option. Energy, of course, some of your schools will be fortunate enough to have perhaps slightly more efficient energy systems than others, and you've got the options of thermostatically controlling certain areas of the school. In others, in old Victorian buildings, etc., you've got one boiler and it's got two settings, on and off. Lots of schools have no control of this, some do, but it might be something that we look at. For example, just not putting the heating on the weekends at all, which some schools leave it on all the time. Those are options that we might want to look at, but again, we'd need our school business managers to actually cost those out. Many of you I know will have already explored joint purchasing either through your MAT or actually through some of these purchasing organisations that actually exist. They are options for shaving costs rather than actually making swathing economies, etc. But they're things that we ought to think about. And for each and every one of us, there will be other elements of what we do in our schools that have a cost attached to them. For me, I think if we're forced into situations where we have to make economies, nothing is potentially off the agenda. And therefore, I think as governors, we have to be challenging that accepted wisdom. We have to be asking the questions about all areas where potential savings could actually be realised. So a few questions for us as governors to actually ask. First and foremost, have we actually got clarity of understanding in terms of where we are right now financially? What does the outturn look like for if you're in a maintained school for the end of March next year, or if you're an academy for the end of August next year? Are we heading towards a precipice, or are we there already? We have to understand that as governors. What assumptions have we actually based not just this year's budget on, but also those 3-year forecasts? How realistic are they? And of course, the starting point for most schools' budgets and forecasts is about numbers on roll. So coming back to admission numbers again, have a look at those. If you've seen your admission numbers fall because of birth rate or for whatever reason in the last 2 or 3 years, look at what you're suggesting is actually going to happen in 2024 and 2025. Is that realistic? Because if we don't tackle those sorts of issues now, we're storing up an even bigger problem for 18 months, 2 years down the road. And again, what we were just talking about on the last slide, have we considered all of the options? Now, there might be, there'll be some head teachers and other senior leaders in our schools that say, no, that's not open for discussion. I don't think those are acceptable responses anymore. I think as governors, our moral obligation is say everything has got to be open for discussion. We can have those discussions and they can inform our decisions, but nothing is actually off the agenda at the moment at all. And of course, something that we should never let lose sight of is that there is external advice and support out there. Those of you in Multi-Academy Trust will have your own teams of finance, HR people, etc. Make sure that they're actually being accessed. But if you're in a maintained school, who is your provider? Are you using your human resource provider? Are you using the organisation that you receive financial support from? That might be the local authority. If it is, talk to them. Again, burying our heads in the sand isn't an option here. Getting external advice at an early stage is definitely a positive option. And that brings me on to where we need to sit as governors in terms of knowing how the finance cycle works in our school. And I've made a couple of mentions so far about these things take time. We've actually got to be mindful of where we're going to be in 3 years' time, etc. We need to understand how the financial cycle works. And this is a very basic flow chart which actually shows you how this works. I haven't put dates on this because the dates vary from between the maintained sector and the academy sector, of course. But the budget planning right at the top there at the 12 o'clock position, that's the start of the annual cycle in many ways. And if you're in a maintained school, you will know that towards the end of next month, most local authorities, most boroughs, unitary authorities, etc., will be expecting that draft budget plan to be submitted to them so that they can get a feel for the sort of situation that is actually going to be realised in the authority as a whole, or the borough as a whole. And that's the opportunity for us. And again, there were comments on the board earlier that many of us in the authority are thinking of actually submitting a deficit just to demonstrate how big a problem it is. That's fine, but it's not fine I would suggest as this is our standing position. You have to be aware that, okay, we're making a point here, but what have we done to back that up? Because we know that realistically, submitting a deficit budget isn't going to be an option, because if all schools do that, then the local authority most certainly will not have the funds, I'm guessing, to be able to support those. So that process starts in, as I say, in November in the maintained sector. It's usually around about end of May, June time in the academies sector, because of course their fiscal year starts on the 1st of September. After the budget plan has been submitted, of course, we then get a lot of information that comes out in terms of support, either from our multi-academy trust or from the local authority, telling us information, perhaps what we should be budgeting for next year in terms of teachers' pay, support staff awards, energy, all of those sort of things. But, you know, support, advice and guidance that helps us firm up a budget. We ought to get a better a better understanding rather of the admissions number for next year, because of course all of those preference forms come back to schools in the period in the new year, and all of that information feeds into approving the draft budget. Now, again, this will vary slightly, but for many authorities, they still use the traditional May 1st date for final submission of that budget with the chair of government's name on it, etc., even though that's a month after the start of the year. The funding letter basically is confirmation, and again, different authorities work in different ways, but once local authorities or multi-academy trusts get confirmation of how much money they're going to be receiving from central government, and of course in the case of maintained schools that's passported through the local authority, there will be a letter that usually goes to the head teacher and the chair of governors confirming what the final amount of funding is. And then of course, be it the 1st of April or the 1st of September for academies, the financial year begins, and then our role as governors is about how we monitor performance against that. Now, we're not going to go into any detail about the financial monitoring reports today, but of course there are statutory expectations on governors in academies in terms of how regularly they actually see those financial monitoring reports. And of course, there is absolutely an expectation in maintained schools that on an ongoing basis, we are monitoring our schools' position against the budget. And I mentioned this very briefly earlier on, but one of the things that we must be looking at now, doesn't happen in all schools, but the FMR system, the financial monitoring report, has the facility to have the outturn, in other words, the projection for where you're going to finish up at the end of the fiscal year, has that as an option on there. As governors, we should be asking, insisting that that is actually made available to us and is updated on a regular basis, just so that we make sure, and many of you will have heard Linda and I say this many times in the past, we're operating in what we call that culture of no surprises. We can't afford to wait until January to know that we're heading towards a pretty substantial in-year deficit at the end of March. We need to know about those things from September onwards. And at that stage, I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to take you through the next few slides. So over to you, Linda.
Thank you, Steve. I just wanted to say one more thing about this financial cycle, if I may, is it may prompt you to think about how you are doing this as a governing board. And with this increased emphasis on the financial pressures and getting it right and being more aware of things financial than we possibly have had to do as governors before, in a similar way to that deeper knowledge that we've acquired with the changes in the curriculum since 2019, being more aware of how things are constructed, put together, and our oversight has been at a slightly deeper level. I think we might be thinking, if we work with a flat structure in our governing boards, maybe there is a need to think about having some kind of financial group that looks at that deeper level, or gets a deeper level of understanding that can bring back to the whole board. You might have a financial committee in your school or academy at the moment, and that's absolutely fine because you will be doing some of this. But for some of you, you might be in a local academy board where you don't have any financial responsibilities at all. And so the questions there might be going back to the trust about the sustainability of your school offer, remembering that children are at the heart, our pupils, students are at the heart of everything we do, even if we don't have these financial responsibilities. So before moving off this slide completely, I'd just like you to think about how effective the way you're structured as a governing board, the kind of knowledge that you have collectively, and if you have a committee as that group, and how it flows back to you. Is it really effective, or do you need to have a discussion about how you might do some of this differently to be more effective? Not differently just for the sake of being making a change, but to be more effective in some of this. And it's not about being operational, it is about being strategic. But in order to ask the right questions, you do have to have a deeper level of knowledge on which to base that. So let's look at some of the things that possibly would be things that your school should have already explored. And again, this is about having that deeper level of knowledge that you can then have meaningful discussions at that deeper level with your school team. Has your school explored some of the documentation, some of the support that is available from the DfE around planning to buy things? And it may be that you are at a point where you do need to make an upgrade to certain areas of your school life. It might be IT, it might be catering, it might be relooking at your energy costs. The Buying for Schools guides does provide that practical information to schools about planning and buying to get good value. So that's one thing that just to check that our schools are exploring and using what is already available. There are a range of other things that are also in place to help boards. There is alternate to commercial insurance from the risk protection arrangements. And then there is another support for a framework of buying goods and services for your school that the school can use. And then finally, and I know some people have asked this on the question panel already, there is a grants online available. And
sorry, Linda, this is the one that I was actually talking about earlier. We have given you the URL for this, ladies and gentlemen, on the penultimate slide.
Thank you. Sorry, Steve, I missed some of the detail of what you were talking about because I was answering some questions, but thank you for clarifying that. And it's probably worth mentioning that there's also an integrated curriculum and planning tool available from the DfE, and that has been updated in July of this year. And that is about the creation of the best curriculum, because again, putting children at the heart of this, our finances are only designed to support the best offer that we can make to our pupils. And that helps a school to create the best curriculum within the available funding. So these are things that are there. You don't need to have read them and studied them in detail, but being aware that they exist will then allow you to ask your school how they have been used, and whether they have been able, whether you've been able as a result of the school using them to have made plans that are as good as they possibly can be in these straitened financial circumstances. So with that in mind, we need to also be aware that we have got some key big ticket items. Our staffing will be a huge cost to us. It'll probably be the largest percentage of the budget spend. And alongside that, you will have the curriculum resources and an ever-growing energy cost, which again, we have no certainty about what will happen to the support that may have been promised at the moment in terms of it continuing in the future. So those are the three big ticket items, if you think, if we look at it that way. But we also need to think about some of the other things that we're responsible for. The physical environment of the school, the buildings and the grounds of the school, and the security and the viability of those buildings, and the maintenance programs that we might ideally have put in place. But it may have been one of those savings that we have said, well, we'll delay a particular aspect of that because we're needing to fund our large, our three main areas. And there may be other things that we would never have considered as luxury, cutting continual professional development for staffing. It's something that no organisation wants to do, but you may have trimmed that down, or sharing that with other schools or parts of your academy trust, which again is a way of maintaining those savings but maintaining some quality. And we may have lost some extra visits that we would have wanted to do with our children, our swimming programs, our trips, our residentials. I know in my school we would usually have a full 1 week residential for our year 6 pupils. This year that has been just 2 nights, so 3 days but 2 nights. So lots of cuts being made in lots of places. We should know what the cost of these big ticket items are. We should hold the school to account for that, make sure that they have challenge it, and make sure that every possibility has been looked at. But we should also be acutely aware that the offer that we're providing for our pupils is still a quality offer, and pupils are still having opportunities to progress and to be able to have that full breadth and depth of the curriculum. Remember those changes that were made in 2019. We should be aware of how this fits together, which is why that integrated tool is such a good resource for a school to use. So let's scratch a little bit beneath the surface here and think about some of the things that we might know, some of the things that might have been part of our discussions about finance in the last 2 or 3 years, and thinking about where are areas where we might reasonably have conversations to challenge and test whether all that could be done has been done. So when was the staffing structure in your school last reviewed? And depending on the size of the school, large secondary schools with large staff, there would be an expectation that this would be part of that annual view of where savings can be made and what is effective and efficient. The smaller the school, there are often points at which certain changes in staff that are moving on or staff that are retiring, and you can maybe plan some of those things in, present opportunities to look at that in a slightly more frequent way to achieve thinking about how you will replace that particular key member of staff often, and whether there are different ways of looking at that, particularly if your roles are also falling, thinking about does that provide an opportunity to therefore combine a class or look at a slightly different senior leadership team structure, for example. So there will be 2 ways of looking at that depending on the size of the school. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Steve, because I know you're in a very large secondary school, and that looks very different, doesn't it, to governing in a small primary school in terms of opportunities for staffing structures.
Yeah, absolutely, Linda. And I think, again, those of you who are governors in secondary schools or possibly even in MATs, because obviously a multi-academy trust, there are options there to, deploy staff across the trust as a way of saving. But I mean, some of the things, for example, that it's a very large, very nearly 2,000 pupil school that I'm chair of, and in that school, we don't, supply teacher. Oh, sorry, very bad English here, but the availability of supply teachers, is a better way of putting it, is pretty slim at the moment. It's very, very difficult, and it's COVID's playing its part still at the moment in our area, but it goes deeper than that. So we've actually employed a number of what we call cover supervisors. Now that's enabled us not just to have continuity of somebody in front of the class, but those sort of advantages, like they do know the students, etc. And it's significantly cheaper than actually finding supply teachers. So there's a real economy there. But at the other end of the spectrum, I'm the governor of a small Key Stage 1 infant school, as I said earlier. That's just not an option there. It's way beyond the capabilities and the constraints of our budget. So it is very much about looking, as we said before, knowing your school, knowing the context you're operating in, and size is part of that, and then thinking about all of those things that could possibly be on the table. I think one of the biggest questions we should be asking as governors at the moment is, are our head teachers, our school business managers, chief finance, are they talking to other people and sharing ideas about what are other people doing to try and make some economies at the moment?
And I think there's no doubt at all that head teachers do talk to each other about these pressures, and they do share some of their good ideas. Certainly, I would imagine that the majority of your schools will be thinking about, or have put in place, certainly in mine, and my school is not a huge school, thinking about using fixed term contracts, or the way in which they use the existing staff if there is somebody who leaves partway through, a member of staff that leaves partway through the year. Particularly, we're finding in our area, I'm very close to Gatwick Airport, the increase in staffing contracts available at Gatwick have had an impact in our local area on a lot of teaching assistants, not only from my school but from other schools, finding that a more attractive option than remaining working within a school for some of the reasons that you've mentioned around EHCPs and SEND pupils already, Steve. So thinking about how you achieve a new structure sometimes will rely on offering a fixed term contract so that you can then look at it again at the end of that period of time. Using teaching and leadership responsibility points wisely, and those are those individuals with additional learning responsibilities that has to relate to teaching and learning, and the way in which those are funded, rather than maybe having an assistant head position, for example. So what is the structure in your school? Do you understand what that structure is? How has it been changed, or how is it planned to change? And are there any opportunities within that to create additional efficiency? And again, that is about you knowing your school and asking sensible, challenging questions to deepen your understanding of what has been proposed and why, and whether it is what the expected impact of that is going to be. Many of you will use volunteers in a range of situations further down the school. Most primary schools will make use of a range of different volunteers, but is that an opportunity that has been fully explored? And when you're looking at that structure overall, has the school really gone down to that very deep level of the costing of every position overall? And finally, thinking about, there are still some areas of the country that are finding it very difficult to recruit and retain teaching staff and non-teaching staff. And our non-teaching staff, or our teaching assistants in particular, are crucial to effective running of classrooms. Thinking about the cost of and the methods that we use to recruit staff. And I know, again, head teachers are very good particularly in the physical localities where they say, oh, I've recently shortlisted and recruited for X position, but there was another very good candidate and I noticed that you were looking for somebody. And that can save a lot of costs in terms of using agencies and employment organisations. So thinking about how and why and how effective and value for money some of these aspects of the way in which you're working are. Now, I'm not suggesting that many of you haven't looked at all of this in some detail over the last 12 to 18 months. I know, for example, many schools have slimmed down their staffing to what in my school the deputy head calls a knife edge, which does mean that the winter is going to be quite challenging if there is a lot of staff illness. So I absolutely appreciate that some of these things do make your organisation a very lean organisation, and there are risks associated with that as well. So I think here once we've got the knowledge about our own school or academy, then I think there is some thinking that we need to do, and then some conversations and discussions, because that's what governance is about, isn't it? It's about building understanding and then having those conversations and knowing that collectively, governors and senior staff, you have looked at this and you have left no stone unturned. So has the conversation been had that reassures you that we have the school have explored every opportunity for the way in which they could organise their staffing, and they've made sure that each of those have been explored and given sufficient merit? Could we attach teaching assistants differently? Now, this is an area where we are definitely at a knife edge. We do not have a teaching assistant in each class. That would have been our ideal, and there is need, but having to have slimmed down 2 or 3 teaching assistants across a wider group, looking carefully at where there is the greatest need and only using teaching assistants wisely to cover that need. That is incredibly difficult. I don't pretend that although that statement sits there in black and white and makes it sound as if it's an easy thing to achieve, that it is. Looking at how the structure of the day looks in terms of thinking about the way the classes work, 4 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon. Is that the best way of organising ourselves in terms of what we're trying to achieve financially? Steve's mentioned cover supervisors versus the cost of supply teachers. Again, more likely to work in a secondary school. And this is a fairly commonly trodden path over the last few years. And then HTLAs, which is higher level teaching assistants, making use of of that qualified person, again, against a supply teacher, or using PPA cover by an HTLA again. These come at a slightly lower cost, just as valuable, and provide excellent provision for PPA and covering for supply. But you may be a school that doesn't have an HLTA, or maybe can't afford to put a member of your staff through that qualification in order to achieve that. But again, it's about understanding and building a picture here that makes sure that your governance has covered all of these areas and that your school is better for that challenge.
And I think, Linda, just on that, as governors, that is a perfectly reasonable challenge to say, well, there are opportunities out there to train teaching assistants to become HLTAs. That potentially could save the school money. And lots of people are putting on the chat room, it's horrible to consider making people redundant. Yes, it absolutely is. We're not suggesting that this is actually a nice option to contemplate, but for some of us, it will be the only option. And sadly, there may be some casualties, but I think we have to realise that whilst some schools might actually be losing staff, might be making staff redundant, lots of schools are finding it incredibly challenging at the moment to recruit staff. So I think, there's a bigger picture here. And I think our responsibilities as governors are in our individual schools, in our individual trusts. Yes, of course, we have a duty of care about staff, and we're not walking away from that, but we have to do what's right for the children. And sometimes there are some very painful and difficult decisions to make. And I think that's what we're talking about here. So challenging that accepted wisdom that says, well, what would we save if we used HLTAs, high-level teaching assistants, to deliver PPA rather than buying in a supply teacher? That could be a significant amount of money. And sorry, Alison, PPA is planning, preparation, and assessment time. Every teacher is eligible for 10% of their teaching timetable time to not be teaching, so that they can use that time to plan, to prepare, and to complete children's assessments. Sorry, Linda.
No, thank you for clarifying that, Steve. I should have done so myself. And I think yes, there will be schools that will have to make redundancies. There is no doubt about that. But some of these suggestions on this slide, that some of these challenges are presented by opportunities when a member of staff leaves, thinking first and foremost, what do we need to do as a school as a response to that resignation? One of our HTLAs has gone to work at Gatwick. We would love to replace her. We can't afford to do that. It's not a redundancy situation. It's not a situation that we would have wished to be in as a school, but is one which we will have to live with at the moment to meet these financial challenges in a low birth rate area. And, none of this is easy. However, and I think if we move on to the next slide, this is absolutely the case. Doing nothing is not an option. We are absolutely clear that legally we cannot set a budget that isn't balanced. We do need to meet this challenge sooner rather than later. And again, back to the way in which we do finance as a governing board, if it's as a whole group, is our financial challenge being covered sufficiently at governance level? If we've got a committee, finance committee, then that's definitely the place for this. But if you're going to cover it as a full board, giving it sufficient time on the agenda and sufficient opportunity for governors to develop their depth of knowledge and ask those challenging and difficult questions, we need to make sure we're factoring that in to do this well. As Steve said, looking at that outturn and the forecast at the end of the year, and knowing that where we are in the cycle at the moment, the projection is suggesting that it's getting better or worse from that outturn. And what is the school doing about that if that situation is becoming more difficult? And the planning needs to start now, seeking advice from your local authority, seeking advice within your MAT, knowing what those timescales are for, if we're looking at redundancies, they come with a long lead-in time. They come at a cost. So knowing what both the cost and the timescales are, looking at if you're going to combine classes, looking at the timescales for bringing that in, what that will look like in future years, because combining a class at the early part of a school, at the beginning when children first come to the school, that needs to be built in across the whole of the school progression planning forward. And be open and honest, and expect your school to be open and honest with you. Head teachers are often very good at painting a very positive picture, but we need, as governors, to know worst case scenario. What is the bottom line here? And let's be open, honest, challenging, but also supportive. Some difficult decisions will have to be made by schools, and they need their governors to stand behind them when they've made these joint decisions together, difficult as they may be, so that you can move forward and provide the very best you can within those financial constraints. It is challenging. We are all in this challenge together. So demonstrating that care and compassion and concern for our whole school community, but for those people who are going to be making those difficult decisions, going to be reducing the teaching assistant complement across a group of classes, or going to be starting redundancy procedures. None of these things are what teachers joined the profession to do. But nonetheless, in order for us to be to do the legal and best thing we can for our school, we do need to support our schools in getting to a situation where we have a balanced budget, or we have a plan for how we are going to move forward towards that. I know we've been answering questions as we have been going along, and I don't know, Steve, you've been looking at the questions while I've been speaking. Is there anything else that we that's on the question board that we might want to answer?
There's one I've left, Lynn. I'm sorry. If I say this is anonymous, you'll know who you are, but the person who's actually put this in hasn't got their name on there. So, and this is a point that I think a lot of people have made. Acknowledging the fact that we can't set, as governors, we can't set a deficit budget, but we're constantly reminded that we're ultimately responsible for the educational outcomes of the children and young people in our schools. The pay award alone was a challenge for us, this person is saying, let alone the other pressures. What advice can you give a school that has fixed costs that cannot be met by funding? Seek help from HR and finance is the only thing I can realistically say. Unfortunately, we're not in a situation where there's a magic wand here. There really isn't. And this is why I think we, all of us, have to, and again, I'm not advocating civil disobedience or anything, as I said earlier, but I do think we have to ensure that the authorities, the government, and sometimes some of you will even think maybe the media, I think that's appropriate too. We have to do what we need to do to ensure that government understands what's happening and what the impact of their actions or their inactions are having on our school system at the moment. I think we've had so many education secretaries in the last month. I think it was 4 education secretaries ago, back in July, and Nadine Zahawi, who was education secretary then, said that because of the energy costs, realised it was going to cause issues in schools, but he was, would not look favourably on schools that decided to not open as a way of saving money. I'm not advocating that, I'm really not, but I think schools are going to be put into situations where they have to make very unpalatable decisions to protect the best interest of their school communities. And as I say, I'm sorry, Linda and I don't have a magic wand to offer you today. Tea and sympathy isn't the answer either. As governors, we have to actually make our voices heard for our schools. We have to encourage our head teachers collectively and individually to do something about it. But we know that we are, faced with a government at the moment that perhaps has a broader agenda than actually ensuring that our schools are adequately funded. There will be some schools that find themselves in impossible situations, and I'm afraid that that's not something that we actually have that answer to. So, as Linda says, we've had lots and lots of questions. We are aware that we've run a minute over the allocated time today. So if there are a couple of questions left on the panel that I don't think we've responded to, we'll get back to you individually with an email on those. So just to say, folks, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Those are the 2 URLs that I promised you would actually be on the penultimate slide, and you've got them there, so download the slide pack. And just remains for us to say thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Linda and I have enjoyed your company in the session, and it's nice to see so many of you getting up early to join us. We look forward to seeing you again in the not too distant future. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye, everybody.